global poll finds that most countries are worried about a threat to their democracy, and that threat is the United States. This is an incredible survey. The findings come in a poll commissioned by the Alliance of Democracies Foundation among 50,000 respondents in 53 different countries. And what they found by asking these respondents some questions about their fears and how they feel about democracy in their own countries was that 44% of respondents in these 53 countries surveyed are concerned that the United States threatens democracy in their country. Fear of Chinese influence is, by contrast, 38%, and fear of Russian influence is actually the lowest at 28%. So for everything that we hear about China and Russia here in the United States, when you look at the world stage and how other countries feel about us, they find the United States government to be a much bigger threat to their own democracy. And if you've been paying attention to our foreign policy and our decades of US-led coups in various countries in the Middle East and in Latin America, you can understand why. Other findings from this survey indicate that since last year, the perception of US influence as a threat to democracy around the world has increased significantly from a net opinion of +6 to a net opinion of +14. This increase is particularly high in Germany, +20, and China, +16. Now, I gotta say, it is fascinating that the number is higher in Germany versus China, because whether you're dealing with a Democrat or a Republican in the US government right now, you will certainly hear the war drums toward China. Right now, of course, it's more of a Cold War than anything, but it's something to be concerned about, especially when you want to do something about the real threat, not only to national security here in the United States, but to the world, and that's climate change. You need to be able to cooperate and collaborate with countries like China, like Russia, but the US government's rhetoric, even under the Biden administration, leaves much to be desired when it comes to diplomacy. So I'm certainly concerned about that. But even with all that rhetoric, Germany tends to be a little more concerned about the United States than China is. But nonetheless, China's numbers are pretty high. They are concerned about the United States meddling in their affairs. Now, let's be clear about something. Obviously, China is not a democracy. So China is probably worried about the United States meddling in their affairs. But to claim that China is like some wonderful democracy that the United States might tarnish is obviously not what we're trying to say here. Let's be real about that. Now, let's also move on and talk a little bit about what the respondents had to say about their biggest non-governmental threat. And what this survey found was that the single biggest cited threat to democracy is economic inequality. 64% of respondents felt that inequality was the biggest threat to democracy. Now, 48% of the power of, or 48% say that the power of big tech companies, as opposed to the simple existence of social media, is a threat to democracy in their country. Among democracies, the US is actually the most concerned about big tech at 62%. And I can understand why. When you have this monopolistic system where there are only a few tech companies that reign supreme and they crush the competition, yeah, they're a little too powerful. There's no question about that. So if you're feeling concerned about that here in the United States, just know that there are people all over the globe who are also concerned about it. And right now, anytime we hear anything about antitrust lawsuits or antitrust actions against these big tech companies, it seems to be fueled by conservatives who don't want to be censored but don't actually want to do anything about antitrust violations. Or in some cases, there are prosecutors who are looking into it. But so far, I haven't seen anything robust in terms of solutions to the very clear monopolistic power of these tech companies. Now, China isn't, like as I mentioned, China isn't a democracy. Russia has its own authoritarian issues. So I just want to repeat that again, because while there is legitimate criticism toward the United States and its meddling into other countries, we also need to be real about where these countries that are critics of the United States are coming from as well. The US might not be a threat to Chinese democracy, but the US certainly is a threat when it's selling weapons to Japan and India in an effort to intimidate China. That's some of the actions that started under the Trump administration, actually really started under the tail end of the Obama administration, continued under the Trump administration, and will probably accelerate during Biden's administration as he continues to, use the rhetoric that we heard during his address to a joint session of Congress. China came up quite a bit. Now, I do want to also mention that when this survey was done, Trump was still in office. It was toward the tail end of his administration. And so the attitudes that some of these respondents have toward the US government might be a little different today. Donald Trump, of course, attempted to stage coups in Venezuela, failed miserably. He staged a successful coup in Bolivia that luckily didn't last long. But with all these actions that were taking place, it's kind of understandable why anyone would have that kind of feeling toward the United States government. But I also want to mention that this all coincides with an important report that came out on The Intercept. It was written by Ken Klippenstein and Ryan Grim. And what they did was shed light on some new findings in regard to the US-led coup in Bolivia. And what they did was of course, Ken Klippenstein always manages to get his hands on leaks and emails and documents to do this kind of incredible reporting. But what they found was that the Department of Justice under the Trump administration threatened MIT researchers with subpoena in collaboration with Bolivian coup regime. Emails to the analysts show that the Trump administration's complicity with a Bolivian criminal investigation. So as they write in the body of their piece, emails reveal that the Justice Department's involvement in the Bolivian coup regime's criminal investigation into alleged voter fraud. The inquiry targeted a pair of respected MIT researchers about their work for the Center for Economic and Policy Research, in which they broadly refuted suspicions that Bolivia's Socialist Party had rigged the election. Now remember, prior to the coup, what everyone heard was that the OAS, the Organization of American States, had found that Evo Morales had engaged in voter fraud in order to steal the election. Now, the OAS is based in Washington, D.C., and it's also mostly funded by the United States government, which is why I say that it was a US-backed coup. 60% of the funding for the OAS comes from the United States. Now, there was no evidence provided by the OAS in regard to alleged voter fraud in Bolivia. Evo Morales was forced out of the country. The opposition in the country took to the streets as soon as the OAS had released these allegations. And then you have an awful extreme right winger come into office, even though she hadn't been democratically elected. But what kind of saved the day for Bolivia was the fact that these MIT researchers were like, let's actually look into these allegations of voter fraud and see if we can confirm anything. Researchers at MIT, commissioned by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, took a closer look at the data and evidence behind the allegations and concluded what many other independent observers had already found. The fraud claims were bogus. And so after that happened, luckily there was enough pressure on this right-wing coup government in Bolivia led by Janine Áñez to hold new elections. And they did hold new elections. The right-wing government is now out, and Luis Arce is now the new leader of Bolivia. He comes from the same party that Evo Morales is in. And Evo Morales was happily able to return back to the country. Now, the whole point of this report by The Intercept is that DOJ officials under the Trump administration tried to subpoena these MIT researchers over the research that they had conducted because it undermined their coup. And this is the kind of game that you'll see people in positions of power play in order to maintain US hegemony in the interests of businesses that are based here in the United States. This is exactly how it goes down. If you have the audacity to find evidence that counters the narrative that allows for a coup to happen, well, then you need to be threatened, you need to be served with some sort of subpoena. Luckily, the DOJ dropped it. But again, it's important to know how these things happen behind the scenes and how censorship really does occur when power is challenged the way that these MIT researchers challenged power in regard to this coup. So This is my long way of saying that I certainly empathize with the survey respondents who are concerned about their own system of government, their own democracy being harmed in some way by US intervention. We have a long history of doing it, there's no question about that. Even in recent history, we did it. We also attempted to do so in Venezuela and luckily failed. But if you look at examples like Guatemala with the United Fruit Company, if you look at examples like Iran and how we overthrew its first democratically elected leader and decided to install a dictatorial religious government instead, again, you can understand why survey respondents responded the way that they did.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR, so those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.